Have you ever sat at a table that was supposed to feel like home, and suddenly realized something wasn't right? Imagine this: a room filled with warmth, the smell of food, the sound of laughter, familiar faces all around. A moment that should feel safe, predictable, comforting, and then, without warning, everything changes. Not with a shout, not with an argument, but with something far more unsettling. A single piece of paper, placed quietly on the table, yet loud enough to silence the entire room. In that moment, nothing looks different, but everything feels different. Because sometimes, the most life-changing moments don't come with noise. They come with realization. Tonight's story isn't just about a shocking moment, it's about what happens when love is questioned, when value is measured, and when someone is forced to decide, stay silent, or finally see things for what they truly are. This isn't just a story about confrontation, it's about clarity, about strength, about the moment you stop asking, "What do I owe?" and start asking, "What am I worth?" And trust this, by the time this story reaches its end, you won't just be listening, you'll be thinking. The moment didn't feel real at first. It was supposed to be a warm, familiar Thanksgiving evening, the kind filled with laughter, the clinking of plates, and the comforting smell of food that carried years of tradition. Conversations floated lightly across the table, small jokes, shared memories, the usual rhythm of a family gathering. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet there was an undercurrent, something subtle, almost invisible, like a shift in the air before a storm. Then it happened, a simple gesture but one that cut through the room like silence after a loud noise. A paper placed on the table, deliberate, almost ceremonial. At first glance it didn't register, just another document, maybe something trivial, maybe nothing at all. But as eyes adjusted and attention narrowed, the weight of it became impossible to ignore. $200,000. Not spoken loudly, not announced dramatically, but somehow louder than anything that had been said all evening. The number sat there, heavy and undeniable, turning the warmth of the room into something cold and unfamiliar. It wasn't just the amount, it was what it represented. Every year of childhood, every meal, every roof overhead, suddenly reduced to a calculation. The laughter that had filled the space moments ago vanished, replaced by a tension so thick it felt almost tangible. No one reached for their food. No one spoke. It was as if time itself paused, waiting to see what would happen next. Faces around the table shifted, some curious, some uncomfortable, some avoiding eye contact altogether. The atmosphere changed from celebration to confrontation without a single raised voice. It was no longer about gratitude or togetherness, it had become something transactional, something measured. The kind of moment where emotions don't explode outward but instead sink deep, settling into the chest with a quiet intensity. Confusion mixed with disbelief, trying to make sense of what was unfolding, trying to understand how a day meant for appreciation, had turned into something else entirely. The shock wasn't loud or chaotic, it was quiet, controlled, almost surreal, a realization unfolding in real time, where every second stretched longer than the last, and the meaning behind that single piece of paper became clearer with every breath taken in silence. The moment the number became clear, the weight of it settled deeper than anyone expected. It wasn't just a figure written on paper, it was presented with intention, as if it carried authority, as if it demanded acknowledgement. The way it was placed on the table made it feel official, almost like a contract that had been waiting for the right moment to be revealed. There was no laughter attached to it, no hint that it was a joke. The seriousness in the air made it impossible to dismiss. It was meant to be seen, meant to be felt. The idea of a bill for being raised twisted something fundamental. Childhood, which is usually remembered through moments of care, protection, and growth, was suddenly reframed as a debt. Every meal, every school fee, every necessity was no longer an act of responsibility or love, but an expense being recalled and totaled. The years that should have felt unconditional were now being measured, as though each act of parenting had been recorded with the expectation of repayment. It changed the meaning of everything in an instant. What made it heavier was the setting. A moment meant for gratitude had been turned into a stage for something entirely different. Surrounded by family, the gesture didn't just feel personal, it felt public. The presence of others amplified it, turning what could have been a private conversation into a silent spectacle. The number wasn't just directed at one person, it was displayed for everyone to witness, as if validation from the room mattered. The pressure of that kind of exposure didn't need words, it existed in the stillness, in the way no one interrupted, in the way attention lingered. There was also a strange sense of calculation behind it. The precision of the amount suggested time had been spent adding things up, assigning value to years that were never supposed to be quantified. It hinted at a mindset where care had conditions, where giving was not free but tracked. That realization carried a quiet sting, because it meant the past wasn't remembered the same way. What one side may have seen as life and growth, the other had seen as cost and obligation. The presentation itself said more than any explanation could. It wasn't rushed or uncertain, it was controlled, almost practiced, the kind of action that comes after thinking something through, after deciding that this was the moment to make a point. And in that decision the message became clear without needing to be spoken aloud, that everything given had a price, and that price was now being called in. What cut the deepest wasn't the number itself but what it replaced. In a space where warmth and belonging should have been felt, there was a sudden shift into something cold and distant. The expectation in the air wasn't empathy or understanding, it was reaction. The kind of reaction that comes from being cornered, exposed, made to feel small without a single harsh word being spoken. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it carried a quiet intensity that pressed down just as heavily. There's a unique kind of pain in realizing that a moment meant for connection has turned into something else entirely. Instead of being seen as part of the family, there was a sense of being evaluated, almost like standing under a spotlight with invisible criteria being judged. The presence of others only magnified it. Every glance, every subtle shift in posture, every silence from the people around the table added to the feeling. No one needed to say anything. The situation spoke for itself. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was something deeper. A kind of emotional exposure that made it hard to find steady ground. The mind tries to process what's happening, searching for an explanation that makes it less real, less personal. But the reality doesn't soften, it stays there, undeniable, reshaping the moment into something that can't be undone. The comfort that once defined those gatherings suddenly feels distant, almost unfamiliar. There's also a quiet question that starts to form. How long has this been building? Because something like this doesn't come out of nowhere. It carries the weight of unspoken thoughts, of feelings that were never addressed directly. And now, instead of being shared with care, they're being revealed in a way that leaves no room for dignity. That realization lingers, making the moment feel even heavier. The hardest part is the shift in perception. What was once assumed to be unconditional begins to feel conditional, almost transactional. And when that shift happens in front of others, it doesn't just stay between the people involved, it becomes something witnessed, something that changes how everyone sees the situation. The sense of belonging starts to fracture, replaced by a quiet awareness that something important has been lost in that single defining moment. There is something deeply unsettling about watching something as pure as love being reframed into numbers. What was once understood as care, protection, and responsibility begins to feel like a ledger, quietly kept and suddenly revealed. The idea that every meal, every necessity, every moment of support had been mentally itemized changes the meaning of those experiences. It introduces a coldness where warmth once existed, as if affection had always been tied to an invisible calculation waiting to surface. The shift doesn't happen gradually in that moment. It hits all at once. Memories that once carried comfort begin to feel uncertain, almost questioned. Was that act of kindness freely given, or was it something being added to a total? The mind starts retracing the past, not with nostalgia but with doubt. It becomes difficult to separate genuine care from the possibility that it was always seen as an investment. That uncertainty creates a quiet distance, even while sitting in the same room. What makes it heavier is the implication behind it. Turning love into a transaction suggests that nothing was unconditional, that everything had a cost attached to it even if it was never spoken aloud until now. It places a value on existence itself, as if being part of a family comes with an eventual bill. That idea alone challenges something fundamental, because love, especially within a family, is expected to exist without terms or conditions. There's also a sense of imbalance that becomes impossible to ignore. A transaction implies agreement, a mutual understanding of terms, but in this situation there was no consent, no negotiation, no awareness that such a debt was being formed. It was one-sided, silently constructed over time and then presented as fact. That lack of choice makes it feel less like a request and more like an imposition, something that demands acknowledgement without offering fairness. The emotional weight of that realization doesn't come from anger alone but from the loss of something intangible. Trust begins to shift, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a subtle, irreversible way. The meaning of past experiences changes, and with it the sense of security that once came from them. What should have been rooted in care now feels tied to expectation, and that transformation leaves a quiet but lasting impact on how everything is understood. What made the moment even heavier wasn't just what was happening, but where it was happening. It wasn't a private conversation behind closed doors where emotions could be processed without an audience. It unfolded in front of everyone, in a space that was supposed to feel safe and familiar. That shift turned something already difficult into something deeply exposing. The presence of others changed the nature of the situation, adding layers of pressure that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. There's a unique kind of discomfort that comes from being put in a position where all eyes are on you, not out of support but out of curiosity or uncertainty. Every glance carries weight. Some people look away, not wanting to be involved. Others watch closely, trying to understand what's unfolding. And in between those reactions, there's a silence that amplifies everything. No one steps in, no one interrupts, and that absence of intervention makes the moment feel even more isolating. Just about embarrassment in the usual sense. It's about being placed in a situation where dignity feels fragile, where the ability to respond is complicated by the awareness of being observed. Words don't come easily in moments like that, not because there's nothing to say, but because everything feels magnified. Any reaction, anger, confusion, even calmness, becomes part of a scene that others are witnessing. That awareness creates a kind of restraint, a tension between wanting to respond authentically and wanting to maintain control. The setting transforms the interaction into something performative, whether intended or not. It stops being just a conversation and starts to feel like a statement being made in front of an audience. That changes the emotional stakes entirely. It's no longer just about the relationship between the people directly involved, it becomes about perception, about how the moment is interpreted by everyone present. That added layer can make the experience feel even more overwhelming because it extends beyond the immediate exchange. What lingers most is the sense of exposure. The realization that something deeply personal has been brought into a public space without consent creates a quiet discomfort that doesn't fade quickly. It reshapes how the moment is remembered, not just as a difficult conversation, but as one that unfolded under watchful eyes, where privacy was replaced by visibility, and where the impact extended far beyond the people at the center of it. That makes that once felt that's suddenly brought forward, not as memory, but as leverage. Things that once felt like ordinary parts of growing up, small sacrifices, adjustments, compromises, are no longer remembered in their original form. Instead, they are reshaped into evidence, used to justify a claim that didn't seem to exist before. It creates a strange and uncomfortable shift, where moments that were once neutral or even meaningful now feel like they've been stored away for a different purpose. Childhood is filled with countless instances where parents make decisions, give things up, or go out of their way. Those actions are usually understood as part of the role, something that comes with raising a child. But when those same actions are later presented as burdens that need to be repaid, they lose their original meaning. They stop being expressions of care and start to feel like obligations that were never clearly communicated. That reinterpretation changes how those memories are experienced in the present. There's also a sense of imbalance in how those sacrifices are being framed. Growing up involves a natural dependency, a stage where choices are made on behalf of the child without their input. To later turn those choices into something owed creates a tension that's hard to reconcile. It suggests that what was once freely given now carries a hidden expectation, one that wasn't visible at the time. That realization can feel unfair, not because the sacrifices didn't happen, but because they're being used in a way that alters their meaning. What deepens the impact is the timing. Bringing up years of effort and framing them as something transactional in a single moment compresses a lifetime into a single narrative. It leaves no room for context, no space to acknowledge the complexity of those years. everything becomes simplified into a single idea, that the past has a price. And in that simplification, the emotional weight of those experiences is overshadowed by a financial interpretation. There's a quiet kind of hurt in seeing something that once felt like part of a shared life being turned into a tool for pressure. It creates distance, not just in the present moment, but in how the past is viewed moving forward. Memories that once carried a sense of belonging begin to feel different, touched by the knowledge that they can be brought back not as stories, but as proof in a conversation that was never expected to happen. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, and almost overwhelming. It settled over the table in a way that made even the smallest movements feel amplified. The clink of a fork, the shifting of a chair, the quiet inhale before someone considered speaking. All of it seemed louder against the stillness. It wasn't a peaceful pause or a natural break in conversation. It was the kind of silence that comes when something unexpected disrupts the flow, leaving everyone unsure of how to respond. What made it more intense was how long it seemed to stretch. Seconds felt like minutes, each one carrying the weight of what had just been revealed. No one rushed to fill the gap, and that absence of sound turned into its own kind of pressure. In most gatherings, silence is quickly replaced by chatter, by someone changing the subject or attempting to lighten the mood. But here, that instinct didn't appear. Instead, the quiet remained, almost as if the moment demanded to be acknowledged before anything else could continue. The tension within that silence wasn't just external, it was internal as well. Thoughts moved quickly, trying to process the situation, to find the right response, to understand what had just happened. At the same time, there was a hesitation, a sense that any words spoken might shift the situation even further, might make something already difficult even harder. That uncertainty created a kind of stillness, where speaking felt risky and staying silent felt just as heavy. Around the table, reactions were subtle but noticeable. Some people focused on their plates, avoiding eye contact as if looking away might create distance from the situation. Others glanced briefly, then quickly redirected their attention elsewhere. These small gestures added to the atmosphere, reinforcing the sense that something significant had occurred, something that couldn't simply be ignored or brushed aside. Even without words, the collective awareness of the moment was clear. The silence carried meaning. It reflected discomfort, surprise, and perhaps even a lack of knowing what was appropriate to say. It created a space where everything felt suspended, where the usual rhythm of interaction had been interrupted. In that stillness, the situation seemed to settle more deeply, its impact becoming clearer not through discussion, but through the shared experience of everyone present, held together by a quiet that spoke louder than any conversation could. What unfolds in that moment isn't just external tension. It becomes an internal struggle that's far more complex. On one side, there is a deeply ingrained sense of respect, something built over years, shaped by upbringing, culture, and the natural instinct to honor those who raised you. That respect doesn't disappear just because the situation feels wrong, it stays present, almost urging restraint, reminding you to stay composed, to not cross a line that has always been there. At the same time, something else begins to rise. Something quieter at first, but just as powerful. A sense of self-worth that questions what is happening, that resists the idea of being reduced to a number or placed in a position that feels undeserved. It's not loud or aggressive, but it's firm. It asks whether staying silent means accepting something that shouldn't be accepted, whether respect should come at the cost of dignity. That internal voice doesn't demand confrontation, but it doesn't allow complete submission either. Balancing these two forces creates a kind of emotional tension that isn't visible to others but feels intense within. Every possible response seems to carry consequences. Speaking up might be seen as disrespectful, as challenging authority in a way that could escalate the situation. Staying silent, on the other hand, might feel like agreeing, like allowing the moment to define something that doesn't feel true. That push and pull makes it difficult to find steady ground, because neither option feels entirely right. There's also a sense of responsibility tied to the setting. Being surrounded by others adds another layer to the conflict. It's not just about personal feelings anymore. It's about how actions will be perceived, how they might affect the atmosphere, how they might reflect on everyone involved. That awareness can make the decision even harder because it introduces the need to consider more than just what feels right internally. In that space between respect and self-worth, time seems to slow, thoughts become more deliberate, emotions more contained. It becomes less about reacting and more about choosing carefully, about finding a way to remain grounded despite the pressure. The conflict doesn't resolve instantly, but it shapes the moment in a profound way, turning it into something deeper than a simple exchange, something that challenges not just the situation, but the understanding of where the line between respect and self-respect truly lies. In the middle of everything, a quiet but unsettling question begins to take shape, one that doesn't demand an immediate answer but refuses to disappear. It lingers beneath the surface, threading through every thought, every emotion, every attempt to make sense of what is happening. Isn't loud, but it's persistent. What does family really mean in a moment like this? For years, the idea of family is often built on assumptions, support, understanding, a sense of belonging that doesn't need to be explained because it's simply felt. It's something that's taken for granted in the best way, a foundation that feels steady and reliable. But when a situation challenges that foundation, even subtly, it creates a shift that's hard to ignore. The definition that once seemed clear begins to blur, not completely, but enough to cause doubt. There's a contrast that becomes impossible to overlook. On one hand, there are memories of connection, of shared experiences that created a sense of unity. On the other hand, there's the present moment, where that unity feels strained, where actions don't seem to align with those earlier understandings. That contrast creates tension because it forces a comparison between what was believed and what is being experienced now. It raises the possibility that the meaning of family might not be as fixed as it once seemed. The question goes deeper than the situation itself. It touches on expectations, what is given, what is received, and what is assumed to exist without conditions. Disrupted, it becomes necessary to reconsider them, not in a dramatic or immediate way, but in a gradual, reflective manner. It's less about rejecting the idea of family and more about trying to understand it in a new context, one that includes both the positive and the challenging aspects. There's also a sense of searching within that question. Not just for an answer but for clarity. It becomes a moment of reflection, where the meaning of connection, responsibility, and care is examined more closely. The situation doesn't provide a clear definition, but it opens the space for one to be reconsidered, shaped not just by tradition or assumption but by personal understanding and experience. Beneath the surface of that moment, there's a sense that something has been building over time, something not fully expressed until now. It doesn't appear suddenly without reason, instead it carries the weight of thoughts and feelings that may have gone unspoken for years. That realization shifts the focus from just the present situation to the past, suggesting that what is happening now is only the visible part of something much deeper. The idea of hidden resentment introduces a layer of complexity that isn't immediately obvious but becomes harder to ignore once it's considered. It suggests that certain emotions may have been quietly accumulating, shaped by experiences, expectations, or perceptions that were never openly discussed. These feelings might not have been visible in everyday interactions, but they didn't disappear. They remained, gradually forming a perspective that eventually found its way into this moment. What makes it more difficult to process is the lack of clarity around when or how those feelings developed. Without open communication, it's left to interpretation, creating uncertainty. Were there moments that contributed to this shift that went unnoticed? Were there expectations that were never voiced but still held significance? The absence of direct conversation means those questions don't have clear answers, which adds to the sense of confusion. There's also a contrast between what was perceived and what might have actually been felt. Interactions that seemed normal at the time may now be re-examined through a different lens, as if they held meanings that weren't fully understood then. This creates a kind of retrospective tension, where the past feels slightly altered, not because it has changed, but because the understanding of it has. It becomes harder to rely on previous assumptions, as they may not fully align with what is being revealed now. The presence of unspoken resentment also highlights the impact of silence over time. When emotions aren't expressed openly, they don't simply fade away. Instead, they can grow in subtle ways, shaping attitudes and reactions without being directly acknowledged. By the time they surface, they often carry more intensity than they would have if addressed earlier, making the moment feel heavier and more difficult to navigate. What becomes increasingly clear in that moment is the imbalance of control that has always existed beneath the surface. It's not something that was necessarily obvious before, but the situation brings it into focus in a way that's hard to ignore. The act itself, presenting something so calculated, so deliberate, carries an underlying message about authority, about who holds the power to define the narrative, and who is expected to accept it without question. Power within a family often operates quietly. It's shaped over time through roles, expectations, and unspoken rules about who makes decisions and who follows them. These dynamics don't always feel oppressive. Sometimes they're simply accepted as part of the structure. But when that power is used in a way that feels one-sided, it becomes more visible. It shifts from being an invisible framework to something tangible, something that directly affects how the moment unfolds. There's a sense that the situation isn't just about the content of what's being presented, but about the position it places someone in. It creates a scenario where one side sets the terms, defines the meaning, and presents it as something final. The other side is left to respond within those boundaries, without having had any role in shaping them. That imbalance can make the moment feel less like a conversation and more like a declaration, where the outcome seems predetermined. What makes this dynamic more complex is the expectation of compliance. There's often an unspoken assumption that authority should not be challenged, that questioning it could be seen as disrespect or defiance. That expectation adds pressure, because it limits the range of acceptable responses. It creates a situation where even a calm or reasonable reaction might feel like it carries risk, simply because it goes against the established dynamic. At the same time, there's an awareness that power is not absolute. While one side may attempt to define the situation, the other still has the ability to interpret it, to decide how much of that authority to accept internally. That realization doesn't immediately change the external dynamic, but it introduces a shift in perspective. It creates space for a different kind of response, one that isn't entirely controlled by the structure that has been presented, even if that structure remains present in the moment. What makes the situation even more complicated is how it's framed, not as something harsh or unfair, but as something meant to teach, to guide, to instill responsibility. The words or tones surrounding it may carry a sense of justification, as if the intention is constructive rather than controlling. This framing creates a layer of confusion, because it blends authority with reasoning in a way that makes it harder to immediately identify what feels wrong. When something is presented as a lesson, it often carries an expectation that it should be accepted, even appreciated. It suggests that the discomfort it creates is part of a larger purpose, something beneficial in the long run. That idea can make it difficult to respond critically, because questioning it might feel like rejecting the lesson itself. It places the situation in a space where it appears reasonable on the surface, even if it doesn't feel that way internally. At the same time, there's a subtle shift in how reality is being shaped. By framing the situation as a form of guidance, it redirects attention away from the emotional impact and toward the supposed intention behind it. The focus moves from how it feels to what it is meant to represent. This can create a disconnect, where the emotional response doesn't seem to align with the explanation being given, leading to a sense of internal conflict. There's also an element of control in this kind of framing. By defining the situation as a lesson, it limits how it can be interpreted. It suggests that there is a correct way to understand what's happening, and that any other perspective might be seen as misunderstanding or overreaction. This can make it harder to trust one's own feelings, because they don't fully align with the narrative being presented. What makes it particularly challenging is that the intention and the impact don't always match. Even if something is presented as a way to teach responsibility, the way it is delivered can carry a different message entirely. That gap between intention and impact creates tension, because it forces a choice between accepting the explanation or acknowledging the discomfort. And in that space, it becomes clear that not everything framed as guidance truly feels like it's meant to support or uplift. What makes the moment even more striking is the setting itself, because the occasion carries a meaning that directly contrasts with what is unfolding. Thanksgiving is widely understood as a time centered on gratitude, appreciation, and togetherness. It's a day where people pause to acknowledge what they have, to share warmth, to reconnect through food and conversation. That expectation isn't just cultural, it's emotional. It shapes how the day is experienced, creating a sense of comfort and familiarity that people rely on. When something so unexpected disrupts that atmosphere, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Instead of gratitude flowing naturally, the focus shifts towards something transactional, something measured and calculated. The symbolism of the day doesn't disappear, but it becomes overshadowed by what's happening in the moment. That contrast creates a kind of tension that feels deeper than the situation alone, because it challenges the meaning of the occasion itself. There's something unsettling about seeing a day built around giving thanks transform into a situation that feels closer to accounting than appreciation. The presence of a number, of a calculated total, introduces a different kind of language into a space that is usually defined by emotion and connection. It replaces warmth with structure, replacing shared experience with individual evaluation. That shift doesn't just affect the moment, it alters how the entire gathering feels. The setting amplifies the emotional impact because it heightens expectations. On a normal day, a difficult conversation might feel contained, easier to separate from its surroundings, but during a time meant for unity, any disruption feels more pronounced. It stands out more sharply, creating a sense that something important has been interrupted or replaced. The meaning of the day doesn't vanish, but it feels distant, almost out of reach. There's also a sense of irony that lingers in the background. A day meant to celebrate what has been given freely becomes the stage for something that suggests nothing was free at all. That contradiction doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. It exists in the contrast between what the day represents and what is being experienced. It adds a layer of complexity to the moment, making it feel not just unexpected, but deeply out of place in a way that's difficult to fully reconcile. There's a point in moments like these where everything that has been building beneath the surface converges into something undeniable. It doesn't arrive suddenly out of nowhere, but when it finally surfaces, it feels immediate and unavoidable. The situation stops being just uncomfortable or confusing and becomes something more defined, a boundary that has been crossed, a line that can no longer be ignored. That realization marks a shift, one that separates what could be tolerated from what can't. For a long time, smaller moments may have been overlooked or set aside, comments brushed off, expectations quietly carried, discomfort pushed down in favor of maintaining peace. Those moments don't disappear, they accumulate in subtle ways, forming a foundation that isn't always visible until something larger brings it into focus. When that happens, the weight of all those past experiences becomes part of the present, intensifying it in a way that makes it feel bigger than a single event. What defines a breaking point isn't just the action itself, but the clarity it brings. It strips away the ability to rationalize or minimize what's happening. The mind stops searching for ways to soften the situation and instead begins to see it more directly. That clarity can feel both unsettling and grounding at the same time. Unsettling because it challenges what has been accepted for so long, and grounding because it provides a sense of certainty about what feels right and what doesn't. There's also a shift in how decisions are approached. Before this moment, there may have been hesitation, a tendency to weigh different perspectives, to consider the implications of speaking up or staying silent. But at a breaking point, that hesitation starts to fade. The focus moves toward self-preservation, toward maintaining a sense of dignity and balance. It becomes less about avoiding conflict and more about acknowledging what can no longer be overlooked. The emotional intensity of that realization doesn't always express itself outwardly. It can remain quiet, contained, but deeply felt. It's not necessarily about reacting immediately, but about recognizing that something has fundamentally changed. The situation is no longer just another moment to get through. It becomes a turning point, one that shapes how everything moving forward will be understood and handled. In the middle of all the tension and emotional weight, there is a quiet realization that preparation matters more than reaction. While everything happening feels sudden, almost overwhelming, there is a hidden layer beneath it, one that isn't driven by emotion but by awareness. The importance of keeping records, of remembering details, of holding on to proof of one's own journey, begins to surface in a way that feels both grounding and powerful. It's not something that usually comes to mind in the context of family. Relationships like these are often built on trust, on shared understanding, on the assumption that experiences don't need to be documented to be valid, but when those experiences are suddenly questioned or reframed, having something tangible becomes more than just helpful, it becomes essential. It shifts the situation from being entirely emotional to something that can be anchored in reality. Keeping records isn't just about numbers or written proof, it's about acknowledging one's own contributions and experiences. It's about recognizing that effort, responsibility, and growth have their own weight, even if they weren't tracked in the same way. When everything is being reduced to a calculation, having a way to reflect what has been given in return creates balance. It ensures that the narrative isn't one-sided, that there is more to the story than what is being presented in that moment. There's also a sense of control that comes with this awareness. In a situation where everything feels imposed, where the terms seem to be set by someone else, having records introduces a different dynamic. It creates the possibility of responding with clarity instead of confusion, with evidence instead of emotion alone. That doesn't mean the situation becomes easy, but it does mean it's no longer entirely unbalanced. The presence of proof changes how the moment can unfold. It allows for a response that isn't reactive, one that doesn't rely solely on defending feelings but can stand on something more concrete. And shaped in real time, having something to ground that perception makes a difference. It turns what could have been a one-sided narrative into something that can be questioned, something that can be seen from more than one perspective, even in the midst of everything happening at once. What gives those records real weight isn't just their existence but what they represent when brought into the light. They aren't random details or scattered memories. They are a structured reflection of effort, responsibility, and contribution that had been quietly carried over time. In a moment where everything is being framed one way, this proof introduces another side that cannot be easily dismissed. It shifts the focus from assumption to reality, from a single narrative to a more complete picture. Each piece of proof tells its own story, not loudly, not emotionally, but clearly. It reflects instances where responsibility was taken without being asked, where effort was given without expectation of recognition. These moments may not have been acknowledged at the time, but they were real, and they add up in a way that challenges the idea that everything flowed in only one direction. They reveal that the relationship was never as one-sided as it's being presented. There's also a sense of quiet confidence that comes with presenting something factual. Unlike emotions, which can be questioned or minimized, proof carries a different kind of authority. It doesn't argue, it shows. It doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. In a situation where tension is high and interpretations are shifting, that kind of clarity becomes powerful. It anchors the moment, preventing it from being shaped entirely by one perspective. What makes it even more significant is the contrast it creates. While one side may rely on a broad, generalized claim, this proof introduces detail and specificity. It breaks down the idea that everything can be summarized into a single number or statement. It reminds everyone present that life isn't that simple, that relationships are made up of countless interactions, many of which don't fit neatly into a calculation. The act of bringing forward this proof isn't just about defense, it's about balance. It ensures that the situation isn't defined by a single viewpoint, that there is room for complexity and truth. It transforms the moment from something imposed into something that can be examined, something that carries more than one layer of meaning, even if those layers are only just beginning to be fully seen. There's a subtle but powerful shift that happens when the narrative begins to turn. What once felt like a one-sided situation, controlled and directed from a single point, starts to open up into something less certain, less fixed. The moment that seemed designed to define a person in a particular way begins to lose its grip, not through force or confrontation, but through the steady presence of something undeniable, facts that don't bend easily to interpretation. Flipping the narrative doesn't require raising a voice or creating a scene. In fact, its strength often lies in its quietness. It's in the way information is presented calmly, without urgency, allowing it to settle naturally into the space. That calm delivery creates contrast. Where there may have been an expectation of emotional reaction, what appears instead is composure. And that composure changes how everything is perceived because it shifts attention away from emotion and toward substance. The introduction of facts begins to reshape the moment. It challenges assumptions that were previously left unexamined, bringing them into focus without directly attacking them. Instead of denying what has been presented, it adds to it, expanding the picture until it can no longer be contained within a single perspective. This expansion doesn't erase the original claim, but it changes its weight, making it just one part of a much larger reality. There's also a sense of control that comes with this shift. When the narrative is flipped, the situation is no longer something happening to someone, it becomes something they are actively participating in shaping. That change, even if subtle, alters the dynamic. It moves from being reactive to being intentional, from being defined to defining. And that difference is felt, even if it isn't immediately acknowledged. What makes this transformation significant is how it happens without confrontation. It doesn't rely on overpowering the other side or proving them wrong in an aggressive way. Instead, it introduces balance, allowing the truth to stand on its own. In doing so, it creates a moment where the original narrative can no longer remain unchallenged, where it has to coexist with a reality that is more complex, more complete, and impossible to ignore once it has been revealed. In a moment charged with emotion, the instinct to react quickly can feel almost unavoidable. The pressure of the situation, the weight of being watched, and the intensity of what has just been presented all seem to push toward an immediate response. But instead of giving into that impulse, there is a deliberate pause, a decision to slow everything down internally, even when everything externally feels like it's accelerating. That pause creates space, and within that space, something more controlled begins to take shape. A calm confrontation doesn't mean the absence of feeling. The emotions are still there, just as strong, but they are held in check, guided rather than released all at once. It's a conscious choice to respond rather than react, to let words come from clarity instead of frustration. That choice carries its own kind of strength, because it resists the pull of the moment and replaces it with intention. It allows the situation to be addressed without letting it spiral into something chaotic. There's also a noticeable shift in how the room responds to that kind of composure. Where tension might have been building toward conflict, the calmness interrupts that trajectory. It changes the energy, not by removing the seriousness of the situation, but by altering how it is engaged with. A steady tone, measured words, and controlled delivery create a contrast that draws attention in a different way. Instead of escalating the moment, it stabilizes it, even if only slightly. What makes this approach powerful is its clarity. Without raised voices or emotional outbursts, the focus remains on what is being said, rather than how it is being said. It becomes harder to dismiss or deflect, because the message isn't buried under intensity. It stands on its own, direct and deliberate, making it clear that the situation is being understood and addressed fully. Choosing calmness in that moment also reflects a deeper sense of control. It shows an awareness that not every situation needs to be met with equal force, that strength can exist in restraint as much as in expression. It turns what could have been a reactive exchange into something more grounded, where each word carries weight, and where the response feels considered rather than compelled by the pressure of the moment. There's a quiet strength in holding back when everything inside is pushing toward an immediate reaction. In a moment like that, emotions don't disappear. They rise quickly, intensely, demanding expression. Anger, disbelief, hurt, all competing for attention at once. The natural instinct is to release them, to respond in a way that matches the weight of what's being felt. But choosing not to act on that impulse right away creates a different kind of power. One that isn't driven by the moment but shaped by awareness. Not reacting impulsively doesn't mean being passive or unaffected. It means recognizing that the first reaction isn't always the most effective one. Emotions, especially in high-pressure situations, can blur clarity. They can lead to words that might feel right in the moment but don't fully represent what needs to be said. Taking a step back internally allows those emotions to settle just enough for thought to catch up, for intention to take the lead instead of instinct. There's also a sense of control that comes with that restraint. When a situation feels imposed, when it seems like the terms are being set by someone else, choosing how and when to respond becomes a way of reclaiming that control. It shifts the dynamic slightly, turning the moment from something that dictates behavior into something that can be navigated with intention. That shift may not be visible on the surface, but it's significant in how the situation unfolds. What makes this restraint powerful is how it affects the overall atmosphere. An impulsive reaction might escalate tension, feeding into the intensity already present, but a measured response introduces a pause, a break in that escalation. It changes the rhythm of the interaction, creating space where there might otherwise have been conflict. That space allows for a different kind of engagement, one that is less about reacting and more about understanding and responding deliberately. There's a discipline in choosing that path, in allowing time to shape the response instead of letting the moment control it. It reflects an awareness that not every feeling needs to be expressed immediately to be valid, and that sometimes the most impactful response is the one that comes after reflection, when emotions and clarity have found a way to exist together, without one overpowering the other. There's a moment when the situation begins to reveal more than what was initially presented, when the surface explanation starts to show cracks under closer attention. What once seemed like a firm, unquestionable stance begins to feel inconsistent, not because it is directly attacked, but because it is quietly examined. In that examination, certain contradictions start to emerge, small at first, but significant enough to shift how everything is understood. Exposing hypocrisy doesn't require confrontation in the traditional sense. It doesn't need raised voices or direct accusations. Instead, it happens through contrast, through placing actions and claims side by side in a way that allows their differences to become visible. When what is being said doesn't fully align with what has been done, that gap becomes harder to ignore. It creates a tension between words and reality, one that speaks for itself without needing to be forced. There's a subtle power in letting that contrast unfold naturally. Rather than pointing out inconsistencies outright, allowing them to be seen creates a different kind of impact. It invites observation instead of resistance, making it more difficult for those inconsistencies to be dismissed. The realization doesn't feel imposed, it feels discovered, and that makes it more lasting. It shifts the dynamic from argument to awareness. What makes this process significant is how it changes perception. Once contradictions are recognized, it becomes harder to view the situation in the same way as before. The initial narrative loses some of its certainty, its authority softening as other perspectives come into view. This doesn't necessarily resolve the situation, but it alters its foundation, making it more complex and less one-dimensional. There's also a sense of quiet confidence in allowing truth to reveal itself in this way. It shows an understanding that not everything needs to be challenged directly to be understood differently. Sometimes, simply bringing clarity to what already exists is enough. It shifts the focus from defending against a claim to illuminating the reality around it, creating a moment where the weight of the situation is no longer carried by one perspective alone, but shared across a broader, more honest understanding. There's a shift that happens not in the room but within, where the focus moves away from what others expect and towards something more grounded and personal. It begins quietly, almost unnoticed at first, as the need for external approval starts to lose its hold. For a long time, validation may have come from meeting expectations, from being seen in a certain way, from maintaining harmony even when it felt difficult. But in a moment like this, that pattern starts to feel less stable, less reliable as a measure of worth. The realization doesn't arrive all at once. It builds through the discomfort, through the awareness that being defined by someone else's perspective can never fully capture who you are. When everything is being framed in a way that feels limiting or unfair, it becomes necessary to look inward rather than outward. That inward focus creates space to question what has been accepted for so long, to reconsider the idea that approval is something that must always be earned. There's also a sense of separation that begins to form, not a physical distance, but an emotional one. The weight of others' expectations starts to feel less absolute, less controlling. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it no longer defines every response or decision. That shift creates a kind of freedom, one that allows for choices to be made based on personal values rather than external pressure. It's not about rejecting others completely, but about redefining how much influence they hold. What makes this process significant is how it changes the foundation of self-worth. Instead of being tied to how others perceive or judge, it becomes something more internal, more stable. It's built on understanding one's own experiences, efforts, and intentions, rather than relying on someone else's interpretation of them. That doesn't make the situation easier, but it makes it clearer, because the need to prove something to others starts to fade. There's a quiet strength in reaching that point, in recognizing that worth isn't something that can be assigned or taken away by anyone else. It becomes less about meeting expectations, and more about standing firmly in one's own understanding, even when that understanding differs from what others believe or expect. In a moment where emotions are high and tension fills the space, there is a subtle but powerful decision to be made, whether to respond with intensity or to remain grounded. Choosing dignity over drama isn't about suppressing feelings or pretending the situation doesn't hurt. It's about recognizing that not every reaction needs to match the chaos of the moment. It's a conscious decision to stay composed, even when everything inside is pushing toward a more immediate, emotional response. Drama often thrives on escalation. It feeds on raised voices, impulsive words, and reactions that mirror the intensity of what's happening. In that kind of environment, it's easy to get pulled in, to respond in a way that feels justified in the moment but may not reflect what truly matters. Choosing dignity interrupts that pattern. It creates a pause where escalation might have continued, replacing it with something steadier, something more controlled. There's a quiet confidence in maintaining that composure. It doesn't demand attention or try to overpower the situation, but it stands firm in its presence. That steadiness can shift how the moment unfolds, even if only slightly. It changes the tone, making it clear that while the situation is being taken seriously, it won't dictate the manner of response. That distinction matters, because it separates the external pressure from the internal choice. What makes dignity so powerful in this context is that it preserves something essential. While drama can feel consuming, often leaving behind regret or further conflict, dignity maintains a sense of self that isn't shaped by the moment alone. It allows actions and words to align with personal values rather than being driven purely by emotion. That alignment creates a sense of clarity, even in the midst of confusion. There's also an awareness that how one responds becomes part of the memory of the moment. Long after the situation has passed, what remains isn't just what was said or done by others, but how it was handled personally. Choosing dignity ensures that this memory isn't defined by loss of control, but by a deliberate effort to remain grounded, even when the situation itself feels anything but steady. Silence in that moment isn't empty or passive. It carries intention. It becomes a space where everything is being observed, processed, and understood without being immediately expressed. Instead of rushing to fill the air with words, there is a deliberate choice to let the quiet remain, to allow the weight of what has just happened to settle fully. That silence holds more than restraint, it holds awareness. There's a difference between being silent because there's nothing to say, and being silent because the moment demands more than a quick response. In this case, the silence feels purposeful. It creates a pause that interrupts the expectation of immediate reaction. Where others might anticipate defense, explanation, or even conflict, what they encounter instead is stillness. That stillness shifts the rhythm of the situation, making it less predictable, and, in some ways, more powerful. Within that silence, thoughts begin to align. Emotions that initially surged begin to settle just enough to be understood rather than acted upon. It becomes a space where clarity forms, where the right words are not forced but allowed to emerge naturally. This kind of silence isn't about avoidance, it's about preparation. It ensures that when something is finally said, it carries intention rather than impulse. There's also an effect that silence has on others in the room. It draws attention in a way that noise often cannot. Without words to react to, people are left with the reality of the moment itself. The absence of immediate response can create a kind of tension, but it also invites reflection. It gives space for what has been presented to be considered more deeply, without distraction. What makes this silence powerful is how it reclaims control. Instead of being pushed into a reaction by the situation, it sets its own pace. It communicates without speaking that the moment will not dictate the response. And when words finally come after that silence, they carry a different weight. Measured, deliberate, and grounded in understanding, rather than driven by the urgency of the moment itself. There comes a point when the situation no longer feels like something happening from the outside, but something that can be shaped from within. It's a subtle transition, almost unnoticeable at first, where the sense of being overwhelmed begins to give way to a feeling of steadiness. The pressure of the moment doesn't disappear, but it stops dictating every thought and reaction. In its place, there is a growing awareness that control doesn't always come from changing the situation itself, but from deciding how to stand within it. That realization brings a shift in posture, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. Instead of feeling cornered or defined by what has been presented, there is a quiet sense of grounding. The moment no longer feels like something to endure, but something to navigate. That difference changes everything, because it transforms the experience from passive to active, from something being imposed to something being engaged with consciously. Reclaiming control doesn't require a dramatic action or a sudden declaration. It often shows itself in small, deliberate choices, the way thoughts are organized, the way emotions are held, the way words are chosen. It's in the refusal to let the situation reduce identity to a single narrative. It's in recognizing that no matter what is being said or implied, there is still the ability to define one's own perspective. There's also a sense of clarity that comes with this shift. When control is reclaimed, the noise of the moment begins to settle, making it easier to see what truly matters. The focus moves away from reacting to every detail and toward understanding the bigger picture. It becomes less about proving something to others, and more about staying aligned with a sense of self that isn't easily shaken. What makes this moment powerful is that it doesn't depend on anyone else's acknowledgement. It exists internally, independent of whether it is recognized or challenged. It's a quiet decision, but one that carries lasting impact, because once that sense of control is found, it changes how everything that follows is approached, no longer from a place of pressure, but from a place of intention. In a moment where everything feels charged and uncertain, there comes a quiet but significant realization that not every situation has only one path forward. The mind begins to weigh two possibilities, both carrying their own meaning and consequences. One is to walk away, to create distance, to step out of an environment that no longer feels aligned or respectful. The other is to stay, to hold ground, to face the situation directly without retreating. Neither option is easy, and neither is without its own kind of cost. Walking away can feel like reclaiming peace. It creates space, a separation from the tension that allows breathing room, both emotionally and mentally. It removes the immediate pressure, the weight of being in a place where the atmosphere has shifted so drastically, but it also carries a different kind of weight. The awareness that leaving might be seen as avoidance or surrender, even if it is actually a choice made for self-preservation. That interpretation doesn't define the action, but it lingers as a possibility. On the other hand, standing ground requires a different kind of strength. It means remaining present despite the discomfort, facing what has been brought forward without stepping back. It's not about confrontation in an aggressive sense, but about refusing to be moved by the pressure of the moment. Staying can communicate resolve, a sense that the situation will be addressed rather than escaped. But it also demands composure, because remaining in that space means continuing to navigate the tension without letting it take control. What makes the decision complex is that both options are valid in their own way. It's not a matter of right or wrong, but of alignment. What feels most consistent with one's sense of self in that moment? The choice isn't just about the situation itself, but about how it will be remembered, how it will shape the understanding of personal boundaries and strength. There's a quiet awareness that whichever path is chosen, it will carry meaning beyond that moment. It will reflect not just a reaction but a decision, one that speaks to how challenges are faced and how control is exercised, even when everything feels uncertain and unresolved. What remains after everything has unfolded is not just the memory of the moment, but the understanding it leaves behind. Beneath all the tension, the silence, and the unspoken weight of what happened, there is a lesson that becomes impossible to ignore. It doesn't arrive as a sudden realization, but as something that settles gradually, shaping how everything is interpreted moving forward. The idea that love could be measured, calculated, and presented as something owed challenges something fundamental, and in doing so, it reveals a truth that feels both simple and profound. Love, in its pure form, has never been about exchange. It isn't something that keeps score or waits for repayment. When it begins to carry conditions, when it starts to resemble a transaction, it changes into something else entirely. That shift may not always be obvious at first, but once it is seen, it cannot be unseen. It alters the meaning of actions, reframing what was once understood as care into something that feels tied to expectation. The realization that love should not come with a price tag creates a kind of clarity. It separates what feels genuine from what feels conditional, allowing a deeper understanding of what relationships are meant to be. This doesn't erase the past or dismiss the efforts that were made, but it changes how those efforts are interpreted. It places importance on intention rather than calculation, on connection rather than obligation. There's also a sense of reclaiming something that might have felt uncertain in the moment. When faced with the idea of being valued in terms of cost, it becomes necessary to redefine value in a way that isn't tied to numbers. That redefinition isn't given by anyone else, it comes from within. It's built on the understanding that worth cannot be assigned externally, especially not in a way that reduces a person to an expense. What stays after everything else fades is that quiet but steady awareness, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. It reshapes how similar situations will be seen in the future, creating a boundary that didn't exist before. Not a harsh or rigid boundary, but a clear one, grounded in the understanding that some things are not meant to be measured, and that when they are, they lose the very meaning that made them valuable in the first place. In the end, what started as a moment of shock became something far greater, a moment of clarity. Not about money, not about numbers, but about value. The kind of value that cannot be written on paper, calculated, or demanded. It revealed that respect without dignity is empty, that love without freedom is conditional, and that self-worth is something no one else has the right to define. That table, that silence, that single moment didn't break anything that was real, it only exposed what already was. And sometimes, that's the most powerful kind of truth. Because once you see things clearly, you can never go back to seeing them the same way again. What was once confusing becomes certain. What once felt heavy becomes something you can stand above, not under. And the greatest victory in all of it isn't proving a point to anyone else. It's walking away, whether physically or emotionally, with your sense of self intact. Knowing that no matter what was said, no matter what was placed in front of you, you didn't lose yourself in the process. That you chose clarity over chaos, dignity over reaction, and truth over pressure. Because in the end, real strength isn't loud. It doesn't need approval. It doesn't need validation. It simply stands, unshaken. Thank you for taking the time to listen, to reflect, and to step into this story. If this message resonated even a little, carry it with you. Not as something heavy, but as something empowering. And wherever life takes you next, may you move forward with confidence, with clarity, and with the quiet strength to always know your worth. Good luck on your journey, and thank you.